Hey, what's going on, everyone? Continuing our Halo celebration month here in November. Today, I'm going to be talking about my thoughts on Halo 2, the anniversary edition from the Master Chief Collection. And hey, I bought the Master Chief Collection back when it came out on Xbox One, and I actually unboxed the game for you guys in a video, if you remember. But would you believe it, up until a few months ago, I never played the game. I literally never put the disc in my system and started the game. I kept the game in my collection, and I always had the intention that I was going to go play it, but I was so busy with new releases coming out, especially at the end of 2014. There was a lot of games there, and so I was just focused on playing the new and current stuff. But I always thought to myself, okay, I want to eventually go through and play these games via the Master Chief Collection. But I'm actually glad I held off, because again, what this allowed me to do is to play these games in sort of sequential order, the original Bungie trilogy, and I got to understand and really experience the full breadth of the Master Chief original campaign and trilogy, and to see the improvements, especially to the games as each new sequel came out. So I've heard from many people that Halo 2 is the best in the series, that this is the pinnacle Halo experience, that it doesn't get much better than this. And I have to say that, this game really surprised me when I first started playing it, because what we have here is a more story-focused game, a heavily story-focused game. In fact, it's much more heavily focused on its narrative than Combat Evolved ever was. But it's at the sacrifice, at the cost of exploration. And one of the things I praised Halo Combat Evolved for was its level design and its artificial intelligence, which for the time, if you keep in mind that was a game that came out in 2001, which for the time was extremely impressive and still holds up to this day. It was one of those games that I played with, and I was really surprised just how good the game feels, but also how refreshing it feels still in this day and age. When I played Halo 2, I was expecting this to be sort of iterated and added upon, but what I was met with, again, was a more story-focused game with, a lot of great cutscenes, I have to say, especially the Master Chief Collection, where they went in there and completely remade all the cutscenes in gorgeous CGI. I mean, they just look fantastic, they sound fantastic, they're such a pleasure to watch. But the actual game, right, the actual game here plays more like a straightforward linear first-person shooter than the original Combat Evolved did, which was, I would say, more open and like an original Far Cry-esque style of environment, right? It wasn't open world, but it allowed you to approach the environments and situations in sort of multiple ways. And even though that you could only just shoot your way through, right, there's no stealth mechanics, it's still a first-person shooter. It's like you weren't following the same corridor down to get to an environment, at least not at all times. In Halo 2, it's very much that linear experience. The levels are not as open, they're not as free form, but what you do get is beautiful environments that, honestly give you a ton of variety in locations and where you go. And so it's kind of like a mixed bag for me. It's like on one hand, you get more variety in terms of locations and firefights and where you're going, but on the other hand, you don't have that flexibility that you had in the original Combat Evolved game. Now, you may think to yourself that for me, I probably prefer this, being that I love story-focused games, and that storytelling to me is one of the main reasons that I play video games in their own right. It's just something I'm a huge fan of, is great written and well-told stories. And it is true that I really enjoyed Halo 2. However, I felt the pacing of the game really suffered as a result of it being not only, more linear of an experience, but also a much longer experience as well. Yes, this game is more story-focused. It is linear. However, this game is also a lot longer than the original Halo. And ultimately, I felt that the pacing, especially towards the third act, because the game just seems to throw everything at you. It sort of has like this long, drawn-out, epic fight, and all the enemies come pouring out of everywhere to come attack you. And so it feels like you're basically in like a challenge room from like Doom, where you're like constantly have to keep up with all these enemies pouring in. And while that may be fun for, some quick moments, ultimately I just felt like it lasted so long. The ending of this game felt very exhausting to me because it seemed to go on forever. And yes, I did ultimately have a great time, and I actually really enjoyed the story. And I have to say, in terms of a narrative, at least, this is a much more interesting and probably the most interesting Halo story, next to the first one, I would say, because the first one has that intrigue going for it. Because it was the start of a brand new science fiction saga. This one has the characters developed already, and it's just about going bigger and creating a more epic linear experience within this world. And I really did enjoy, being a part of these environments, even though they're more linear and structured, and it didn't give me as much flexibility to sort of explore at my own pace. But that being said, there's also a lot of improvements here outside of just the sacrificing in level design and the more story-focused nature of this sequel. For one, I have to say that Bungie really improved the gunplay in this game. I mean, Combat Evolved felt good even to this day, and keep in mind I played the 360 port of the Anniversary Edition, and even with the, older nature of that remaster, I still felt it quite enjoyable. Halo 2's combat, however, is fantastic. This game feels amazing to play, and Bungie made a lot of improvements to the gunplay alone and added a ton of weapons. For one, you have dual wielding introduced in this game, and I actually used it more than I thought I would because, again, towards the end where it's sort of a grind where you're facing off against a ton of enemies, I actually found dual wielding to be a huge savior for me and dealing with the bulk of the enemies and the danger that I was faced with. So I absolutely loved the gunplay in this game and the way that everything felt. And the inclusion of different weapons. This is a game, they got rid of the assault rifle here, and we have the introduction of the battle rifle, which is fine by me. I mean, I really like the battle rifle and prefer it in most situations. However, they would later add that assault rifle back into Halo 3. But you also have things like submachine guns. The Covenant get also a lot of extra weapons as well. So the whole game just, feels much more fine-tuned and a lot more focused, at least in terms of the gunplay. I mean, the game just feels fantastic to play, even after all these years, and especially with the upgraded 4K visuals on the Series X and 1X. The game looks fantastic and supports HDR as well, so you even get that, bolder, brighter color palette and 60 frames per second, which just accentuates all the excellent gunplay in this game. They just did a fantastic job, and even though I know that the original Halo 2, didn't run or look nearly as nicely as this, I still got to experience the at least core of the gameplay improvements and stuff that Bungie was really working on, so that was quite nice. You also get to play this time around as multiple characters. You have the Arbiter from the Covenant side, which is actually pretty interesting because, I started with Halo 3, and he's kind of introduced into Halo 3 as if something happened, and I never really understood the backstory of that character. And in my opinion, Halo 2 is less about Master Chief and more about the Covenant and the alien race behind it. You get into a lot of political debates with this game in terms of the sci-fi world and, the different races and stuff like that with the alien creatures. It's actually quite intriguing to watch unfold, and you really start to get a sense that, what these aliens are really doing here, what their motivations are, their presence, how things are ran over, on their side of the world. So it's actually a really interesting perspective, and I enjoyed that change for the most part. The Arbiter is a great character in his own right, especially learning about the backstory of who, he was and what sort of motivated him and how he came to, start working with Master Chief, or as they call him, the Demon, which was pretty cool. So there's a lot going here in terms of its narrative, and I learned a lot more about the world. However, for me, at least on the gameplay side, I have to say that I kind of think I prefer the original Halo to this. It just feels better paced, and, as much as I love the story elements of Halo 2, again, towards the end of it, I was just really exhausted with fighting off all these enemies, and it's a lot at once that you're basically fighting off against, right? It's just a ton of enemies coming at you at one time, and the firefights don't let up. It's like an additional 2 or 3 hours of just sort of repetitive, insane gunfights. And while that's really cool, I understand from a gameplay perspective, you want to ramp up the challenge towards the end. I just felt that it dragged on a little bit longer than it should have. It kind of overstayed its welcome, as I like to say with sort of the modern games out today. That being said, the overall experience here is tremendous, and this is a game that improves on, really the bulk of the Halo formula in various different ways, and I just love the actual gameplay improvements that they've made here. And this does feel like a sequel that's, much more, I would say, focused, but at the same time, one that was probably maybe a little bit too ambitious for what they were going for, and they just tried to slam everything in at one time. So it feels slightly miscalculated in a few ways. Nevertheless, Halo 2 is an amazing game, and I'm really happy I actually got to play it because it taught me a lot about the actual universe of Halo. I'm someone who, again, started off with Halo 3 and didn't really know much about the world, and I'm not really much into reading the books or novels as well either, but this game did really help bring me up to speed, and I was really interested in learning about a ton of the things surrounding this world, and the Covenant and the different alien races and how that all works together, their religious movement and whatnot. It was a very, very interesting proposition here, and I quite enjoyed it for those elements. So overall, amazing game after all these years, especially, if you haven't played this game, or at least the remaster of this game, if you have a 1X or a Series X, you can play this game in 4K HDR at 60 frames per second, and that in of itself, in my opinion, is just worth the replay here, because the game just looks tremendous. It really does. I was very, very happy with the presentation of this game, the upgraded visuals and whatnot, especially because I heard they also upgraded the textures to be 4K, once the 1X released. So you got, all those enhancements as well. So, definitely if you have an interest in first-person shooters at all, and, maybe you've never played the original Halo trilogy like I have, this is definitely worth, your time. And, I would say in terms of the gameplay, definitely holds up after all these years. So, hope you guys enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know your thoughts on Halo 2 if you played the original or, only played the anniversary. And how do you feel this game stacked up to the original Halo? I'd be interested to hear if most of you thought that, you like the more open, layered style of the original Halo, or if you prefer the more linear, story-focused nature of this game. There are elements of this game I prefer over the original, but at the same time, it's the pacing that I find myself as I get older. It's really the pacing of games that is the most important element to me. And this is one where I just feel like a little bit too much was done towards the end to try to make it as, ambitious as possibly can be. So thank you guys so much for watching, and have a tremendous day.